Grace froze, her heart pounding against her ribs, a frantic drum against the silence. Vincent Caruso, the notorious Mafia boss, leaned back in his chair, a subtle smile gracing his lips, a predator pleased by a hesitant prey. Moments before, he had casually, almost mockingly, inquired of her Grace Delaney, a timid waitress, barely a shadow in this opulent world, for financial advice. His men had chuckled, anticipating a mumbled apology, a hasty retreat into the anonymity she craved. Instead, fueled by a desperate hope and perhaps a touch of defiance, Grace had bravely swallowed her fear, offered a sincere suggestion, her voice surprisingly steady. Now, the entire restaurant was eerily silent, all eyes, subtle and overt, fixed on the astonished crime lord. Caruso thoughtfully swirled the amber liquid in his glass, then delivered a response that struck Grace like a bolt of lightning, electrifying her senses and blurring the line between fear and fascination. She hadn't imagined that her off-the-cuff remark could lead to this dangerous precipice where opportunity and peril intertwined. The upscale Italian restaurant, Giovanni, buzzed with the subdued chatter of New York's elite as they wrapped up their Thursday night, each conversation a carefully constructed facade. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over tables draped in pristine linen, set with gleaming silverware, a display of wealth and refined taste. Impeccably dressed waitstaff moved between tables with effortless grace, their smiles practiced, their eyes observant. For many patrons, this exclusive haven was a place to be seen, to network, to solidify their position in the city's complex social hierarchy. But for a select few, Giovanni was also considered neutral territory, a safe haven amidst the city's discreetly divided landscape of power and influence, a space where deals were struck and secrets exchanged under the watchful eyes of those who knew better than to see too much. At the edge of the dining room, Grace Delaney smoothed the front of her black apron, a simple garment that belied the turmoil within her, and took a deep, calming breath, attempting to ground herself in the present moment. She had been working at Giovanni for only 4 months and still struggled with the feeling that she didn't quite belong in these glittering, high-class surroundings, that she was an intruder in a world built on generations of privilege. The 23-year-old waitress had grown up in a much more humble part of town, worlds away from the wealthy financiers and socialites who frequented this establishment, a life shaped by hardship and resilience. Each shift left her feeling like an imposter wearing a borrowed uniform, a character in a play she hadn't rehearsed for. Yet, she desperately needed this job, the financial lifeline that kept her dreams afloat. So every evening, Grace mustered a polite smile, perfected the art of invisibility, and did her best to blend into the background, to become another cog in the well-oiled machine of Giovanni. Tonight, however, a palpable tension hung in the air, thick and heavy like a gathering storm. Grace noticed the restaurant manager nervously adjusting his tie over and over, a tic that betrayed his anxiety, and the head waiter barking hushed instructions at the staff, his usual composure replaced by a frantic urgency. Something was different, something that unsettled even the most seasoned employees. News had trickled through the grapevine, rumors amplified and distorted by the restaurant's unique ecosystem, that a particularly notorious guest had reserved the private corner table for a late dinner. Even someone like Grace, who usually avoided the city's rumor mill, preferring the quiet solace of her books, had heard the name Vincent Caruso whispered with a mix of fear and awe, a name that resonated with a chilling power. Caruso was said to control a significant portion of New York's underworld, his influence extending into every corner of the city's illicit activities. Some even claimed he ruled it outright, alongside a handful of other crime family bosses, a shadowy council that governed the city's underbelly. Most law-abiding citizens only knew him from sensational headlines, fleeting glimpses into a world they couldn't comprehend, if they knew him at all. But those in certain circles understood that where Vincent Caruso went, trouble often followed, a dark omen that cast a long shadow. And now he was coming here to Giovanni, to her world. Grace's stomach fluttered with nerves when she realized she might be serving the Mafia boss's table, the very thought sending shivers down her spine. She finished polishing a wine glass with trembling fingers, the delicate crystal feeling fragile in her grasp. Of all nights to be on duty, of course, it had to be this one, the universe conspiring to test her already frayed nerves. Grace desperately hoped to keep her head down, to remain invisible, and simply make it through the evening without incident. A silent observer in a dangerous game. Before long, a hush fell over the restaurant. A collective intake of breath as a small entourage strolled in through the ornate double doors, their presence immediately altering the atmosphere. At its center was a tall, broad-shouldered man in an exquisitely tailored charcoal suit, the fabric molding to his frame with a subtle elegance. He moved with an unhurried confidence, a silent declaration of power, flanked by several men who scanned the room with sharp, watchful eyes, their vigilance a visible shield. Grace knew instantly who he must be, the air around him crackling with an undeniable energy. The photographs in the papers hadn't done Vincent Caruso justice, reducing him to a two-dimensional caricature. In person, the Mafia boss had a commanding presence that seemed to electrify the very air around him, drawing all attention to his center. Dark hair, neatly trimmed and swept back, framed a strong, clean-shaven jaw, a face carved with an almost classical beauty. He possessed a striking, cold handsomeness that turned heads, a magnetism that was both alluring and intimidating. But it was the intensity in his eyes that truly unsettled her, the depths of which seemed to hold both ancient wisdom and unimaginable cruelty. Even from across the room, Grace could feel the weight of that gaze as Caruso briefly surveyed Giovanni, his eyes assessing every detail, as if he owned the place, a silent claim of dominion. A hostess, her smile strained, escorted Caruso and his party to the secluded corner table that had been meticulously prepared for them, every detail carefully orchestrated. Crisp white wine had already been poured into the waiting glasses at each place setting, a subtle gesture of welcome. As he sat, Caruso exchanged a few quiet words with an older gentleman by his side, a man whose weathered face and sharp eyes spoke of years spent in the shadows. An advisor or bodyguard, Grace guessed, judging by the way he constantly scanned the room, his gaze missing nothing. The rest of his men took their seats, the atmosphere at the table tense, yet oddly casual, as if this were both a social outing and a business meeting, a seamless blend of pleasure and purpose. Grace's throat went dry as the head waiter motioned for her to attend that table, his face a mask of professional neutrality. Of course, she was one of the few servers left with an empty tray at the moment, and this table required the most experienced attention, a delicate dance between attentiveness and discretion. She swallowed hard and approached with her pen and notepad clutched tightly, careful to maintain a polite and neutral expression, a shield against the scrutiny she knew awaited her. "Good evening," Grace said softly, willing her voice not to shake as she gave a small nod to the formidable man at the head of the table, the epicenter of the restaurant's unease. "Welcome to Giovanni. My name is Grace, and I'll be taking care of your table tonight." Her eyes flickered over the group cautiously, taking in each face, each subtle expression, trying to gauge the temperature of this dangerous gathering. Vincent Caruso's steel-gray eyes lifted to meet hers, pinning her in place, a hunter focusing on his prey. Under that piercing scrutiny, she felt almost like a butterfly pinned under glass, her every movement scrutinized, her thoughts laid bare. But he merely gave a curt nod of acknowledgement, allowing her to proceed, his silence more unnerving than any words. Grace recited the evening specials from memory, her practiced server's smile concealing her nerves, a mask of professionalism hiding the fear that threatened to consume her. One of the men, a heavy-set guy with a shaved head and a menacing air, cut her off halfway through, barking his drink order without so much as a glance. His rudeness a deliberate display of power. "Whiskey, the Macallan, neat, and keep them coming," he said, his voice rough and impatient. Another quickly added, "Make that too," echoing his companion's demand, reinforcing the group's unity. Grace noted the orders with a quick scribble, trying to ignore the undercurrent of intimidation. The others murmured their preferences more politely, perhaps picking up on Caruso's silence and knowing better than to draw attention, navigating the complex social dynamics of their group. Finally, Grace looked to Caruso himself, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken tension. He had been studying her, one hand idly toying with the base of his wine glass, his eyes unwavering. "And for you, sir?" she asked, amazed at how steady she managed to sound. Her voice a fragile thread in the oppressive atmosphere. The corner of his mouth lifted faintly, a ghost of a smile that hinted at both amusement and something darker. "Chianti Classico," he replied in a low voice that was surprisingly smooth, a melodic counterpoint to his menacing reputation. "Thank you, Grace." Hearing her name on his lips sent a strange little jolt through her chest, a shock of unexpected intimacy. She quickly bowed her head and stepped away to submit their orders, exhaling shakily the moment she was out of their immediate orbit, the weight of their presence lifting slightly from her shoulders. As she punched in the drink orders at the waiter station, Grace's colleague and friend Molly sidled up beside her, her eyes wide with concern and morbid curiosity. Molly's eyes were wide. "You got that table?" she whispered, clearly referring to the Caruso party, her voice barely audible above the restaurant's hum. Grace just nodded, not trusting herself to speak yet. The image of Caruso's piercing gaze still burned into her memory. Her hands were trembling slightly as she pressed the buttons on the register, the simple task requiring an unusual amount of concentration. Molly gave her a sympathetic wince. "Be careful, okay? I heard he can be unpredictable," she warned, her voice laced with genuine concern. "Don't mess up any orders, and definitely don't spill anything on him," she added with a half-serious, half-teasing smirk, trying to inject a little levity into the situation. Grace mustered a tiny laugh, forcing a smile onto her face. "Believe me, I intend to be a picture of perfection," she replied, trying to match Molly's lightheartedness. Inside, her stomach was doing anxious flips, a chaotic dance of fear and anticipation. She knew Molly was trying to lighten the mood, but the warning was warranted. Vincent Caruso wasn't some regular VIP, accustomed to special treatment. He was potentially dangerous, a force of nature that could erupt at any moment. A few minutes later, Grace returned to the private table with a tray of drinks balanced on her palm, her movements careful and precise. She could feel the guarded eyes of Caruso's men following her every move, their silent scrutiny a constant pressure. As she carefully set each glass in front of the gentlemen according to their orders, the conversation at the table hushed, the air becoming even more still. The men had been speaking in low, indistinct tones, their voices barely audible, but they fell silent as she approached, presumably not wanting an outsider to overhear any sensitive talk, a breach of their carefully constructed privacy. Grace's senses prickled with curiosity despite herself, her mind drawn to the mysteries that lay beneath the surface of their hushed conversations. What sort of business did powerful criminals discuss over dinner? What secrets were exchanged in the shadows of this elegant restaurant? She quickly pushed the thought away, a dangerous temptation she couldn't afford to indulge. Eavesdropping on Vincent Caruso was the last thing she should do if she valued her job, and possibly her kneecaps, a lesson learned from the city's unspoken rules. She placed the two whiskeys in front of the impatient pair who had ordered them, their faces etched with impatience and a hint of disdain. They barely paused their murmured side conversation to mutter thanks, their acknowledgement perfunctory at best. The older advisor received his glass of red wine with a polite nod to her, his eyes assessing her with a detached curiosity. Lastly, Grace stepped toward Caruso, who watched her steadily, his gaze unwavering and intense. She gently set the goblet of deep crimson Chianti at his right hand, the ruby liquid catching the light from the chandelier. "Your wine, sir," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Caruso's eyes flicked up from the wine to meet hers, a silent acknowledgement that sent a shiver down her spine. "Grazie," he said, his voice soft but resonant, the single word echoing in the sudden silence. "Thank you" in Italian, a gesture of unexpected courtesy. Grace recognized the word, a lingering memory from a past life. She had spent a year in Rome during an abortive attempt at studying abroad, a youthful dream that had crumbled under the weight of financial reality, but had picked up some of the language, fragments of a forgotten world. The unexpected courtesy and use of Italian surprised her, disrupting her preconceived notions. She hadn't anticipated manners from a man with such a fearsome reputation, a man who seemed to exist outside the boundaries of ordinary society. Caught off guard, Grace offered a hesitant smile before she could think better of it, a spontaneous reaction that betrayed her surprise. Vincent Caruso tilted his head slightly as if something about her piqued his interest, a flicker of curiosity in his dark eyes. But he said nothing more, merely turning to give a pointed look at the man to his left, a silent command that spoke volumes. Taking the cue, the underling cleared his throat and reached into his suit jacket, extracting the wine list with a practiced movement. "We'll take the 2001 Barolo with dinner," the man said to Grace, handing her the wine list back, his tone curt and dismissive. Clearly, that was their choice of bottle for the meal, a signal that the pleasantries were over. Grace nodded and promised to return shortly to take their food order after they'd had a chance to review the menus, eager to escape their intense presence. Escaping once more to the periphery of the dining room, Grace allowed herself a slow exhale, the tension slowly easing from her muscles. So far, so good, she thought, clinging to the small victory. She hadn't dropped anything or offended anyone, a triumph in itself. Caruso and his men were settling in, and with any luck, they would dine and depart without incident, leaving her to piece together her shattered nerves. If only her nerves would settle, she thought, feeling the persistent tremor in her hands. Grace peeked over now and then as she went about tending to her other tables, her curiosity warring with her fear. The Caruso party seemed to be engaged in quiet discussion while sipping their drinks, their faces serious and focused. She noticed Vincent Caruso rarely spoke, mostly listening with an unreadable expression as his men murmured updates or opinions, their voices low and conspiratorial. From the snatches of conversation she caught while passing by, it sounded like they were discussing various business ventures, clubs, construction projects, shipments, normal topics for rich businessmen. Perhaps, though Grace suspected these had criminal undertones, layers of illegality hidden beneath the veneer of legitimate enterprise. As Grace waited for the sommelier to fetch the requested Barolo from the cellar, a task that seemed to take an eternity, she busied herself by straightening clean napkins and polishing cutlery at the service stand, her movements precise and methodical. Her mind wandered to more mundane worries. The stack of bills awaiting her at home, a constant reminder of her precarious financial situation, her upcoming weekend class at the community college, the next step in her long and arduous journey towards a better future, the fact that her worn-out sneakers would need replacing soon, a small but significant expense that she couldn't afford to ignore. She had recently re-enrolled in night courses to finish her degree in finance, scraping together tuition with tips from Giovanni, a testament to her determination. It was exhausting, balancing coursework after late shifts, her days a blur of work and study. But Grace refused to give up on her dream of entering the financial world in a legitimate way someday, a beacon of hope in the darkness of her present circumstances. "If I can just get through a few more semesters," she thought to herself, wiping a spotless fork for the third time, her mind drifting to the future. The money from this job was the linchpin of her plans, the foundation upon which she hoped to build a better life. Finally, the sommelier returned with the expensive Barolo, cradling the bottle as if it were a priceless artifact. Grace delivered the bottle to the table and poured a taste for Caruso's advisor to sample, her hand steady despite the tremor in her nerves. He swirled and approved, and she deftly filled each glass, her movements practiced and efficient. Next, she took their dinner orders, a process thankfully free of any drama, a brief respite from the underlying tension. Vincent Caruso chose the Osso Buccio special, meeting her gaze as he ordered in what almost felt like a challenge, a silent test of her composure, though she couldn't guess why. Grace just nodded respectfully and collected their menus, maintaining her professional detachment. Once the men fell back into conversation, Grace retreated and relayed the order to the kitchen, feeling a small sense of accomplishment. Everything was proceeding smoothly, defying her earlier fears. With the meals underway, she checked on her other tables and refilled a few drinks across the room, keeping a watchful eye on the corner booth. Perhaps her fears had been unfounded, she thought, daring to hope. Maybe this would be an ordinary night after all, despite the notorious company in the corner. a brief interlude in the chaos of her life. She was just returning from dropping off a tray of appetizers at a nearby table when she overheard a raised voice from the direction of Caruso's booth, disrupting the restaurant's carefully orchestrated ambience. Losing money hand over fist. At this rate, we'll be in the red this quarter, someone was saying tensely, their voice laced with frustration and desperation. Grace slowed her steps instinctively, her ears catching the undercurrent of anxiety in the tone. It sounded like one of Caruso's men, his composure cracking under the pressure. I told you the numbers from the Starford deal don't add up. Another man muttered, his voice low and conspiratorial. We might need to cut our losses, boss. Grace tried to mind her own business, to block out the whispers that threatened to draw her into their world. But it was impossible not to hear the annoyance spilling from their hushed, private discussion. She kept her back partially turned, pretending to be absorbed in adjusting the angle of a nearby table's candle, a flimsy excuse for her eavesdropping. A deeper voice laced with impatience cut through the others, Caruso himself, his voice carrying an undeniable authority. Every time we invest in something legitimate, it's the same song and dance, he said coldly, his tone laced with sarcasm. I hire so-called experts to handle finances, and still I'm hearing excuses. Perhaps I should just burn my money in a barrel. At least it would save time. There was a low, uneasy chuckle from one of the men, as if unsure whether to laugh, a nervous reaction to Caruso's dark humor. Grace's lips pressed together, her mind racing. She could practically feel the tension radiating from their table now, a palpable energy that crackled in the air. Another man spoke up, trying to sound confident, his voice trembling slightly. Boss, if we just raise the cover charges at the clubs and maybe cut some staff, we can make up the shortfall. Vincent Caruso made a dismissive noise, a sound that conveyed his utter contempt. Bleed the customers and squeeze our own people dry. That's your brilliant solution, Bruno? He said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, the name hanging in the air like a threat. The one called Bruno fell silent, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Clearly, that suggestion had not pleased Caruso, a lesson learned the hard way. Grace realized she was loitering dangerously close, her curiosity overriding her caution. She should move away, disappear into the anonymity she craved. But in that moment, Vincent Caruso's gaze flickered up and landed directly on her, their eyes locking across the distance. She was still half turned away with her hand on the back of an empty chair, a posture that betrayed her eavesdropping. Miss, Caruso called out to her suddenly, his voice cutting across the low murmurs, commanding her attention. Grace nearly jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. Her mind raced, trying to assess the situation. Had he noticed her eavesdropping? Was he about to have her fired for prying? Slowly, she turned fully to face the table, clutching her tray to her chest, her hands trembling uncontrollably. Yes, sir? Did you need something? Grace asked cautiously, her voice barely a whisper. Vincent Caruso's expression was unreadable, that slight, half-smile ghosting over his lips again, a mask that concealed his true intentions. His men were all looking at her now, some with curiosity, others with annoyance at the interruption, their expressions ranging from mild interest to thinly veiled hostility. Bruno, in particular, the burly man who had suggested raising prices, was eyeing Grace with a frown, his anger palpable. Caruso tapped a finger against the stem of his wine glass, the delicate sound amplified in the silence. Forgive me for pulling you into this, he said, his voice deceptively polite, but we seem to be having a little debate over here. He gestured vaguely at his companions, his movement dismissive. Tell me, Grayson, was it? What do you think a business should do if it's losing money? For a second, Grace was sure she hadn't heard him right. Had the city's most feared mafia boss really just asked her, a random waitress, for business advice, and in such a casual tone, as if genuinely seeking her opinion? Her mouth opened, but no sound came out, her mind struggling to process the absurdity of the situation. This had to be some kind of test or a trap, she thought, her paranoia rising to the surface. Her pulse thudded in her ears, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. Every instinct screamed at her to laugh it off, to say, "I wouldn't know, sir," and back away as quickly as possible, to escape the spotlight and return to the shadows. But in Vincent Caruso's expectant gaze, she sensed a challenge, and perhaps genuine curiosity, a spark of something unexpected. The other men at the table were staring at her, one or two with barely hidden smirks, anticipating her embarrassment, their eyes filled with amusement. Grace flushed, feeling the heat rising in her cheeks. They clearly expected her to stutter or say something foolish, to confirm their preconceived notions about her insignificance. She could feel Molly's eyes on her from across the room and remembered her friend's advice. Asterisk, don't mess up. Asterisk, this was definitely not what Molly had meant, she thought, her mind racing. But the thought steeled Grace's spine, a sudden surge of defiance. If she humiliated herself now, she might not only lose her job, the financial lifeline that kept her afloat. Who knew how a man like Caruso would react? Perhaps honesty and straightforwardness would serve her better than cowering, a gamble that could either save her or destroy her. Grace wetted her dry lips, trying to find her voice. "Well," she began carefully, her voice quiet, but growing steadier as she forced herself to speak, drawing upon a hidden reserve of courage. "If a business is losing money, simply squeezing more out of customers or staff might only fix things short-term. It could drive people away and hurt the business in the long run." A couple of Caruso's men exchanged looks, their expressions unreadable. Bruno, the one who had made that suggestion and earned Caruso's scorn, folded his arms and glared at her openly now, his hostility palpable. Grace's cheeks burned, but she refused to back down. But she continued, addressing Vincent Caruso, though she could hardly believe she was doing so, her words a challenge to his authority. "Sometimes, the issue isn't that customers won't pay or that employees aren't worth their cost," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Sometimes money is disappearing from somewhere in the pipeline." She paused meaningfully, her eyes meeting Caruso's, holding his gaze. It could be an accounting error, or someone taking a cut before the earnings are reported. At that, the faint amusement on Caruso's face faded, replaced by a keener interest, a spark of something dangerous. The table had fallen utterly silent, the air thick with anticipation. Grace was sure she'd gone too far, crossing a line she couldn't uncross. Why on earth had she practically insinuated, in front of Caruso and his crew, that one of them might be stealing? Had she just signed her own death warrant? She braced herself for an explosion of anger, a violent reaction that would confirm her worst fears. The eruption came, but not from Caruso, to her surprise. Bruno lurched forward, one beefy hand slapping the table, the sound reverberating through the restaurant. "What exactly are you implying?" He growled at Grace, his ruddy face darkened with either rage or anxiety, a mixture of both. Perhaps both, she thought, sensing his fear. "You think we can't manage our own books? That's rich coming from a girl who balances dinner trays for a living." "Bruno." Caruso's voice cut through the man's words like a blade, cold, quiet, but undeniably commanding, silencing the outburst with a single word. Bruno immediately closed his mouth, though his glare at Grace remained, his animosity undiminished. Grace's heart was in her throat, threatening to choke her. She couldn't move, pinned by a mixture of fear and the adrenaline of what she just dared to say, her mind reeling from the implications of her words. She quickly looked down at her feet, suddenly very aware of the dangerous line she had crossed, the precariousness of her position. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to presume," she stammered quickly, her apology sounding weak and unconvincing. But Vincent Caruso held up a finger, silencing her apology, his movement deliberate and controlled. "No need to apologize," he said evenly, his eyes still fixed on her, his gaze intense. He leaned back in his chair, considering Grace with that same unreadable expression, his silence more unnerving than any accusation. "In fact, I believe you may be on to something." The faint clink of silverware and distant chatter of other diners were the only sounds in the stunned silence that followed, amplifying the weight of Caruso's words. Grace stared at Vincent Caruso, unsure she'd heard him correctly, her mind struggling to reconcile his reaction with her expectations. He thought she was on to something, that her bold suggestion had merit. Was that agreement in his tone? Caruso turned his head slowly to sweep his gaze over his men, assessing their reactions, his presence radiating power. Tomorrow morning, I want a full audit of the Starfit accounts, he stated, his voice deceptively calm, a velvet glove over a steel fist. The directive was clearly aimed at the entire table, though Bruno in particular visibly tensed, his anger simmering beneath the surface. Every invoice, every expense. If there's a leak, we'll find it. Grace remained rooted to the spot, scarcely daring to breathe, her body frozen in place. Her mind raced to process that her bold suggestion hadn't gotten her killed or fired, but was actually being taken seriously by this dangerous man, her life taking an unexpected turn. Vincent Caruso's attention returned to Grace, his gaze lingering on her face. The slightest hint of a genuine smile tugged at the edge of his mouth, a rare and unsettling expression. Miss Delaney, it seems I owe you thanks, he said, inclining his head graciously, his gesture surprisingly formal. Grace was sure every person within earshot, including herself, nearly fell over in shock, their minds struggling to process the unexpected courtesy. Mafia bosses did not just thank random waitresses. It was a violation of the established order. I was only answering your question, Grace managed, her voice faltering, her face feeling hot. I hope I didn't overstep. Caruso waved a hand dismissively, his movement erasing her concerns. On the contrary, honest answers are hard to come by these days, he said, his voice tinged with cynicism. His steel-gray eyes glinted with something like approval, a spark of respect. You have a good head on your shoulders. Grace couldn't believe what she was hearing, her mind struggling to grasp the reality of the situation. A few seats away, Bruno looked positively sour but said nothing, his anger simmering. The others observed the exchange with interest and perhaps a touch of amusement, enjoying the unexpected drama. Then came the moment that truly left Grace lightheaded, the moment that would alter the course of her life. Vincent Caruso leaned forward and addressed her directly in that low, commanding tone, his eyes locking with hers. Tell me, Grace, he asked, his voice a hypnotic pull. Where did you learn about business and finance? You speak like someone with some expertise, someone who understands the intricacies of the financial world. Grace blinked, her mind struggling to make sense of his question. Was he actually asking about her background now in front of his whole crew? Was this some kind of elaborate game? She swallowed, trying to compose herself. I take night classes at City College, she said quietly, her voice barely audible. I was studying finance at a university before, but had to drop out, she confessed, her voice tinged with regret. Now I'm finishing my degree part-time, she added hastily, trying to downplay her ambition. I'm not an expert or anything. I just pick up on some things. Caruso arched an eyebrow, interest evident, his expression intrigued. Is that so? It wasn't phrased as a question, but a statement, a declaration of his growing curiosity. He regarded her thoughtfully for a moment, his fingertips pressed together. A waitress who knows how to spot a balance sheet problem, a hidden talent revealed by chance. Life is full of surprises, he mused, his thoughts unreadable. Grace's heart thumped, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. She gripped the edges of her tray to keep her hands from shaking, feeling the weight of his scrutiny. Was it her imagination, or did Vincent Caruso almost sound impressed? He exchanged a glance with the older advisor beside him, who gave a slight nod as if confirming something unspoken, a silent conversation that she couldn't decipher. Then Caruso's focus returned to Grace, and he said the words that would replay in her head for days, forever changing her perception of reality. Perhaps I could use someone with your instincts, he said, his voice a low rumble. How would you like to put that finance knowledge to use? Working for me? Grace's jaw nearly dropped, her mouth agape. A collective blink went around the table, the surprise evident on every face. Bruno coughed as if he couldn't believe his ears, his anger flaring anew. One of the other men failed to hide a grin of surprise behind his hand, the audacity of the situation amusing him. Work for you? Grace echoed dumbly, her voice barely audible. She was certain she must have misheard this time, her mind unable to comprehend the proposition. Work for a mob boss? Vincent Caruso actually chuckled, a low sound that made it unclear whether he was joking or not, a hint of menace underlying his amusement. I'm in need of people I can trust, he said, his eyes unwavering. People with brains, he added, his gaze fixed on her. It sounds like you might qualify on both counts. Grace felt her face go through a whole cycle of expressions. Astonishment, disbelief, confusion, a kaleidoscope of emotions. This had to be some kind of strange test or humor at her expense, she thought, clinging to the possibility that this wasn't real. She could hardly form a response, her mind struggling to find the right words. I don't, she stuttered, glancing around, seeking some kind of guidance. Every man at the table was watching her intently now, their eyes scrutinizing her every move, and she realized she had to say something to break the oppressive silence. That's a very generous offer, Mr. Caruso, she managed carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. But I'm just a waitress, she protested, clinging to her identity. Yes, I know, Caruso finished for her, still with that slight smile, a subtle indication of his amusement. But clearly more than that, huh? Grace opened her mouth, still utterly at a loss, her tongue feeling tight in knots. Was he serious? His expression looked calm and sincere, but who could tell? He was a master of deception, she reminded herself. Her heart drummed wildly, a frantic rhythm of fear and excitement. Work for a mafia boss? Doing what exactly? Handling blood-soaked money? That didn't exactly line up with her career goals in finance, she thought, her mind racing. And yet, part of her felt an undeniable thrill at the audacity of his suggestion, the forbidden allure of a life lived outside the boundaries. She realized Vincent Caruso was patiently awaiting her answer, his eyes unwavering, and so were all his men, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Her gaze flickered to Bruno, who still looked like he'd bitten into a lemon, his anger barely contained. Intuition told Grace that accepting too eagerly might paint a target on her back with certain folks at this table, making her an enemy in a world where loyalty was paramount. And truthfully, she had no idea what such work would even entail, the unknown terrifying her. Maybe, she said weakly, her voice barely a whisper, maybe we could talk about it later, a hesitant response that offered a sliver of hope. Caruso inclined his head, understanding the weight of her hesitation in this public setting, acknowledging the complexities of the situation. Of course, another time then, he agreed smoothly, his tone unreadable. Think it over. He reached inside his suit jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. Grace tensed for a split second, her heart lurching in her chest, anticipating a threat. But he simply, a way to avoid drawing attention. Tony, the driver, stepped out and opened the door for her with a polite nod. He was a burly man with a serious demeanor, and she couldn't help but wonder if he was also one of Caruso's bodyguards. Miss Delaney? He asked, his voice deep and gravelly. Yes, that's me, Grace replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The ride downtown was surprisingly quick, and Grace spent the time gazing out the window, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She had no idea what to expect from this meeting, or what Vincent Caruso had in store for her. Tony pulled up to a modern skyscraper, its glass facade gleaming in the sunlight. The building exuded wealth and power, and Grace couldn't help but feel a little intimidated as she stepped out of the car. Tony led her through the revolving doors and into a spacious lobby adorned with expensive artwork and sleek furniture. He spoke briefly to a receptionist, who smiled and directed them to a private elevator. As the elevator ascended, Grace's anxiety grew. This was it. She was about to enter Vincent Caruso's world, and she had no idea what awaited her on the other side. The elevator doors opened directly into a lavishly appointed office suite. The space was vast and open, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city. Modern art hung on the walls, and designer furniture filled the room. But what caught Grace's attention was the man standing near the windows, his back to her. He turned as she approached, and Vincent Caruso's presence filled the room. He was even more striking in person than she remembered. His dark eyes intense and his demeanor commanding. He wore a perfectly tailored suit that accentuated his broad shoulders, and his hair was neatly styled. "Grace," he said, his voice warm and welcoming. "Welcome to my office." He gestured for her to sit in one of the plush chairs near a low table. He sat opposite her, his gaze unwavering. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me." Grace swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. "Thank you for inviting me," she replied. "Your office is impressive." Vincent chuckled softly. "It has its perks," he said. "But let's not waste time on pleasantries. I'm sure you're curious about why I asked you here." Grace nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "I am," she admitted. Vincent leaned forward, his expression serious. "As I mentioned last night, I was impressed by your observations and insights," he said. "You have a sharp mind, Grace, and a keen understanding of people." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I believe you possess a unique set of skills that could be very valuable to me." Grace's brow furrowed in confusion. "What kind of skills?" she asked. "I'm a waitress and a student. I'm not sure what sort of talent that you think I possess. I am well aware of your occupation and goals, but I'm also aware that there is far more to you than either might suggest," Vincent responded with an almost knowing tone. "I do not require you to pour any more coffee or serve any plates or study accounting. I am also interested in someone who can handle the pressure of high-stakes situations, and who has a quiet knack for seeing things that others miss." He smiled slightly, seeing in her eyes that she was starting to get intrigued. "That is precisely why I need someone like you." His words held a strange allure, a promise of excitement and danger that both thrilled and frightened her. He reached across the table and slid a folder towards her. "Take a look at that, and then we can talk about the specifics." Grace's fingers trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were documents detailing a complex financial transaction, filled with numbers and legal jargon that made her head spin. She looked up at Vincent, her expression questioning. "I don't understand," she said. "What does this have to do with me?" Vincent smiled enigmatically. "That, Grace, is what I want you to figure out." The air held a secret, thick with unspoken possibilities as the black car idled just a whisper away from her building. A silent sentinel bathed in the cool city night. Felt like a scene lifted from a movie, yet here it was undeniably real. The driver, a man named Tony, with eyes that held a lifetime of stories and a smile that suggested a surprising gentleness, ushered her into the plush interior. "Miss Delaney?" he'd asked, his voice a warm rumble, and with a hesitant yes, Grace stepped into a world she never knew existed. Anxiety coiled in her stomach like a cold serpent, each turn of the car a twist tighter. "Just a meeting," she repeated to herself, a mantra against the rising tide of unease. But even as she tried to steel herself, the allure of Vincent Caruso, the undeniable magnetic pull of his world, whispered promises she couldn't quite ignore. The car deposited her not into shadows, but into the blinding light of a midtown high-rise, a monument to power and ambition. An elevator whisked her upwards, delivering her directly into a breathtaking panorama of the city, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a space of muted luxury, a stage set for a drama she was only beginning to understand. And there he was, Vincent Caruso, a figure both imposing and mesmerizing, his gaze drawn to her as if he'd been waiting an eternity. "Grace, welcome," he said, his voice a low, resonant melody that seemed to vibrate through the very air around her. And in that moment, everything shifted. The fear didn't vanish, but it mingled with a thrilling sense of anticipation, a dizzying cocktail that left her breathless. He settled her onto a soft sofa, his presence a warm pressure nearby, and the conversation began, a careful dance of truth and veiled intention. He laid bare the betrayal within his organization, the siphoned money, the festering wound of dishonesty, and confessed it was she who pierced the armor. "Thanks to you I am," he had said when affirming the findings. acknowledging his gratitude with those words. The revelation of Bruno's treachery hung heavy in the air, a dark cloud promising a storm she could only imagine. And then, the shift, the question hanging unspoken between them. What about her? I could definitely use someone like you working with me, he offered. His words a seductive invitation into a world both dangerous and undeniably alluring. He saw something in her, a spark of intuition, a flame of courage that he valued above all else. He spoke of his world, the delicate balance between legality and shadow, the moral complexities that lay waiting, and offered her a choice. Walk away, untouched, or step in and become a part of something bigger, something more. She admitted her fears, her desires for a normal life, yet couldn't deny the pull of curiosity, the unique opportunity to use her skills in a way she never thought possible. A flicker of a smile played on his lips, as if her honesty was a rare and precious commodity. He laid out his proposition, a seemingly innocent role as a financial consultant, a chance to advise on legitimate businesses, to bring a fresh perspective untainted by the old ways. He valued her for that honest perspective and fresh set of eyes to overlook a world he had already conquered. But the underlying truth hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. This was Vincent Caruso, a man who lived by a different set of rules, and aligning herself with him came with a price. There's also the matter of trust, she stated, to which Vincent revealed the findings of a thorough background check on her, confirming that she was who she appeared to be. Hardworking, principled, trying to build a better life for herself and her family. Her honesty earned his trust, her family values mirrored his own. He knew of her father, his humble auto repair shop, the struggles she had faced after his passing. And in that shared understanding, a connection formed, a bridge built on empathy and respect. The man had done his homework, but in that, it eased her into a sense of security because he cared. The offer was tempting, a chance to finish her degree, to gain invaluable experience, to step into a world of power and influence. But it came with a catch, a dark shadow lurking beneath the glittering surface. The catch is that you'd be stepping into my world, he admitted, his eyes locking onto hers. Once you do that, things change. You might see or hear things that are difficult. He laid bare the potential consequences, the doors that might close in her normal life, the risks she would be taking. He wouldn't lie to her, wouldn't sugarcoat the truth. The truth was out there, and he was prepared to make a decision. And then, the final choice, laid out before her with stark clarity. Walk away, no obligations, or step in and be taken care of, protected, given a place in something bigger. Her heart pounded, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. Could she return to her simple life, knowing what lay behind the curtain? Could she accept his offer, knowing the dangers that lurked beneath his charm? I'm worried about Bruno, she admitted, her fear a tangible presence in the room. His expression hardened, his voice taking on a steely edge of finality. Bruno will be handled. I won't let him or anyone else harm you. That I promise you. And in that moment, she knew she had already made her choice. It had been made the moment she had spoken up, the moment she had accepted his help, the moment she had met his gaze and seen the glimmer of something real within those dark eyes. All right, Vincent. I'll help you, she said, her voice barely a whisper. A slow smile spread across his face, transforming his features with a subtle light. I'm very pleased to hear that, Grace, he responded with an air of gratitude. On a trial basis, she added, wanting to reassure her own conscience, and still wanting to maintain some control. The truth was, she knew there was no turning back now. He offered his hand, a gesture of trust and acceptance. She reached out and clasped it, his hand warm and strong, engulfing hers. He turned her hand palm up between his, studying it for a long moment, his gaze intense. You have my word, Grace. You'll be safe with me, he said quietly, his voice a deep promise echoing in the silent room. I take care of those under my protection. And in that moment she believed him implicitly. There was a weight of responsibility behind those words, a sense of duty that she felt in the depths of her soul. I believe you, she replied softly, the words of vow whispered into the space between them. Before they could solidify the agreement, a sharp knock at the door shattered the moment, and Angelo burst in with news of Bruno's escape. The hunt was on. Vincent's demeanor shifted in an instant, the relaxed conversationalist gone, replaced by the decisive leader. The world was crashing around her again. He apologized for the interruption, his expression urgent, and ordered that she be taken home, protected, kept safe until Bruno was dealt with. "Trust me, Grace. Go home. Stay alert and let my men watch over you. I will take care of Bruno. You have my word on that," he said. His voice a soothing, yet confident, balm to her fears. And with that, she was whisked away, leaving Vincent Caruso to deal with the storm she had unwittingly unleashed. Back in her apartment, surrounded by shadows and the silent vigilance of her new bodyguard, the reality of her situation crashed down upon her. She had stepped into a world of danger and intrigue, a world where trust was a rare and precious commodity. As the evening wore on, she received a text message, a simple reassurance that he was safe, that Bruno was being taken care of. And in that small gesture, she found a sliver of comfort, a fragile hope that she had made the right choice. She was in too deep now, but as he had promised, everything's fine. The silence before the storm is always the most deceptive. Isn't it? A breath held, a moment stolen from the clutches of fate. What if everything she believed, everything she clung to, was nothing more than a fragile illusion, about to shatter like glass beneath a heavy boot? A tremor, deep and unsettling, ran through Grace. Was it the first tendril of hope unfurling in her heart, or the icy grip of dread tightening its hold? "Thank you, Vincent. Truly," she typed, her fingers dancing across the screen with a desperate urgency. His reply was simple, yet loaded with an unspoken promise. "Get some rest, Grace. I'll see you tomorrow." Tomorrow. The word hung in the air, heavy with possibilities. Would it bring the dawn of a new beginning, or merely a deeper descent into darkness? A hesitant sense of relief warred with the nagging guilt that gnawed at her conscience. A man's destiny, a dangerous criminal named Bruno, was hanging in the balance, and her actions had tipped the scales. Yet Bruno had forged his own path, and she could only navigate the consequences of hers. Bolting the doors and drawing the curtains against the encroaching night, Grace finally succumbed to the bone-deep weariness that threatened to consume her. The last few days had been a vortex of fear and uncertainty, a whirlwind that had left her breathless and disoriented. As her eyelids fluttered shut, a tiny spark of optimism flickered amidst the anxiety that still clung to her like a shroud. Perhaps, after tomorrow, this nightmare chapter would finally end, allowing her to step into a new narrative, written under brighter, kinder skies. But little did Grace suspect, the tempest had one final, terrifying act to unleash before the first rays of dawn dared to pierce the darkness. She was jolted awake, ripped from the fragile sanctuary of sleep by a violent thud against her apartment door. For a disoriented moment, she questioned her senses, wondering if it was merely a phantom sound conjured by her troubled mind. But the luminous digits on her nightstand clock, 1:13 a.m., confirmed the chilling reality. Sitting bolt upright, her heart hammered against her ribs like a frantic drum, each beat echoing the growing unease that coiled in her stomach. Another muffled impact reverberated through the apartment, followed by a low, guttural groan that sent shivers down her spine. It was Daniel, her security guard, and he was in pain. A surge of raw, primal fear jolted her fully awake. Something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. Scrambling out of bed, her fingers instinctively reached for her phone, her lifeline in this terrifying predicament. But just as her hand closed around it, the apartment door exploded inward with a deafening crash, splintered wood flying across the room like deadly shrapnel as the chain lock surrendered to brute force. A strangled scream escaped Grace's lips, but it was abruptly cut short as two shadowy figures lunged into her bedroom, their faces obscured by the darkness. Her fingers fumbled desperately to dial Vincent's number, but a gloved hand snatched the phone from her grasp before she could even press the call button. "Going somewhere?" a sneering voice hissed, laced with a venomous undertone that sent a wave of nausea through her. Stumbling backward, she felt a second man seize her arms roughly from behind, his grip like iron. She kicked and twisted, struggling against his suffocating hold with a desperate, animalistic strength. "Let me go!" she cried, her voice a strangled whisper of terror. Panic surged through her veins like ice water, threatening to drown her in its frigid depths. Where was her guard? A third, blurred shape materialized in the hallway, a dark silhouette slumped against the floor. It was Daniel, unmoving, his body limp and lifeless. The man restraining her pinned her wrists painfully behind her back. "Feisty," he grunted, his voice devoid of any human warmth. "Tape her." With ominous speed, a roll of duct tape appeared, its glinting surface reflecting the harsh moonlight filtering through the window. Grace thrashed wildly, but the first assailant forced a strip of the sticky, unforgiving tape firmly over her mouth, effectively silencing her screams. Her hands were yanked even further behind her back, bound tightly together with more tape, the pressure cutting off circulation and sending shooting pains up her arms. Her eyes burned with helpless tears of fear and frustration. This couldn't be happening. Not to her. Not like this. "Boss wants her in one piece," one of the men said, his voice low and menacing, sending another shiver down her spine. "Careful, boss." That single word, uttered with a chilling reverence, sent a deeper, more profound fear coursing through Grace's veins. It had to be Bruno. He had orchestrated this audacious attack, defying all logic and reason. Despite all of Vincent's precautions, Bruno had somehow managed to slip through the cracks, a malevolent force determined to destroy everything in his path. Roughly, they hauled her out of the apartment, her bare feet skidding uselessly on the cold, unforgiving hallway tiles as she desperately tried to dig her heels in, attempting to resist their relentless advance. But it was futile. The men were simply too strong, too determined. Daniel was sprawled out near the doorway, a clearly visible gash marring his forehead, the crimson blood already staining the floor. But through her blurring vision, she saw his chest rise and fall faintly. At least he was still alive. She silently pleaded for him to regain consciousness, to somehow manage to raise the alarm. But they were already dragging her roughly toward the stairwell, their movements swift and brutal. The building was eerily quiet, the silence amplifying the horror of her situation. Most of her neighbors were long since asleep, blissfully unaware of the violent drama unfolding just a few feet away from their own apartments. One flight down, the men shoved her unceremoniously through an emergency exit and into the darkened back alley, the cold night air biting at her exposed skin. A nondescript van idled there, its side door already slid open, waiting like a gaping maw ready to swallow her whole. Grace's muffled cries went unheard as she was lifted off her feet and thrown roughly into the back of the vehicle, landing with a jarring thud that stole her breath. The door slammed shut with a resounding thud, plunging her into absolute darkness, a darkness that mirrored the terror engulfing her soul. Within seconds, the van roared to life and sped off, its tires squealing in protest as it turned sharply through the city streets, its movements erratic and unpredictable. Grace, her hands bound tightly behind her back and her mouth gagged with duct tape, struggled to steady herself as the van swayed violently from side to side, each jolt sending a fresh wave of panic through her. Her mind raced in terror, desperately trying to make sense of the situation, grasping at any shred of hope in the overwhelming darkness. "Stay calm. Think," she urged herself, fighting against the rising tide of despair that threatened to overwhelm her, to drag her down into the abyss of hopelessness. Vincent would realize that something was wrong eventually. He was too perceptive, too attuned to her well-being to remain oblivious for long. But would he realize it in time to save her? She clung to the memory of his solemn promise to protect her, a promise that had been etched in her mind with unwavering conviction. But he didn't even know that she'd been taken. Not yet, unless Daniel had somehow managed to regain consciousness and call in backup. As the agonizing minutes dragged on, each one an eternity of fear and uncertainty, Grace forced herself to try and focus on the small details, anything that might help her later, any clue that might lead Vincent to her. The van made several turns, its path winding through the city streets, heading, it seemed, towards the industrial side of town, a desolate landscape of warehouses and factories. She felt the road's surface change to something rougher, something less smooth. Maybe they were driving through a warehouse district, with its old cobblestone loading areas, a labyrinth of shadows and hidden dangers. The van slowed, its engine sputtering as it neared its destination, and eventually came to a complete stop. The back door was yanked open with a screech, revealing the harsh, blinding glare of floodlights that assaulted her eyes after the long period of darkness. One of the thugs, his face obscured by the harsh light, climbed into the back of the van and grabbed her roughly by the shoulder, pulling her out into the light with a force that made her wince. Grace blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the sudden brightness, her vision still blurry and distorted. They were inside a large, garage-like space, a cavernous warehouse interior that smelled of dust and decay. Stacks of crates cast long, distorted shadows that stretched across the concrete floor like grotesque monsters, adding to the surreal and terrifying atmosphere. A few other armed men stood around, their faces grim and unreadable, their presence adding to the palpable sense of menace. And there, pacing nervously in front of a makeshift office partition with a pistol clutched tightly in his hand, was Bruno. The sight of his ruddy, contorted face sent a jolt of hatred and raw fear through Grace's heart. He looked like a man who had been pushed past his breaking point, a desperate animal cornered and ready to lash out. Sweat beaded on his brow, and his eyes were wild and unfocused, reflecting the madness that consumed him. He stalked menacingly toward her as the henchman held her firmly in place, his grip unyielding. "You," Bruno spat, his voice dripping with venom as he looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on her fear-stricken face with a cruel satisfaction. "You're the little nobody who started this whole mess." Grace glared back at him, summoning every ounce of defiance she could muster, although hot tears of anger and fear were now streaming down her face, blurring her vision. She tried to shout at him through the layers of duct tape covering her mouth, to unleash the torrent of rage and fear that threatened to consume her, but it came out as nothing more than a muffled, pathetic noise, a sound that only served to fuel his sadistic pleasure. Bruno sneered, a cruel twist to his lips. "What's that? I can't quite hear you." With a cruel, almost sadistic smirk, he nodded to one of his goons, his eyes glinting with a malevolent light. The man stepped forward without hesitation and ripped the duct tape off of Grace's mouth in one swift, brutal motion, the sudden pain on her raw, tender lips causing her to gasp sharply. "You won't get away with this," she said hoarsely, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to maintain a semblance of composure. "Mr. Caruso will." "Mr. Caruso will what? Come and save you?" Bruno cut her off, laughing sharply, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I wouldn't be so sure about that. By the time he even figures out where you are, we'll be long gone." He leaned in close, his breath hot and sour on her face, his proximity suffocating. "If he finds you at all, that is." Grace refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cower in fear, to break under the weight of his threats. "He's coming for you, Bruno," she said, forcing a steely conviction into her tone, willing her words to carry the weight of truth. "You're the one who should be scared." That earned her a swift, brutal backhanded slap across her cheek that sent her reeling, the force of the blow disorienting her. Stars burst in her vision as pain blossomed in her face, threatening to overwhelm her. Bruno grabbed her chin roughly, his fingers digging painfully into her skin, his grip like a vice. "Listen, you little brat. I had a nice little setup running here until you decided to stick your nose where it didn't belong. Years of skimming a bit off the top, a few here, a few there, and that high and mighty Caruso never even noticed a thing. Then you, a damn waitress, come along and ruin everything in one night." He released her chin with a violent shove that nearly knocked her off her feet, his anger palpable and threatening. Grace caught herself, breathing hard, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "So it's true, then?" she said bitterly, her voice laced with a mixture of anger and disappointment. You were stealing from him all along. Bruno scowled, waving his gun carelessly in the air, his actions betraying his growing unease. That pompous bastard never appreciated me. I practically built half of his operations in that sector, and he still treated me like I was nothing but expendable help. So what if I took a cut? I earned it. His face contorted in anger, his words spilling out in a torrent of resentment and bitterness. But thanks to you, he's had it out for me ever since. He tried to set a trap this evening, thinking I wouldn't notice. Bruno let out another mirthless laugh, the sound chilling her to the bone. I slipped him easily, and now I've got his prized pupil as insurance. Grace's stomach turned, a wave of nausea washing over her. You're going to use me to bargain? Bruno simply shrugged, his eyes devoid of any empathy or remorse. Maybe. Caruso's predictable in some ways. He's got that old-fashioned sense of honor when it comes to women. I bet he'll trade himself and a pile of money for you, and I'll be waiting. He nodded toward a metal support beam, his expression cold and calculating. Tie her there and gag her again. I've heard enough of her voice. Rough hands forced Grace toward a pillar, her legs trembling with fear and exhaustion. Someone looped rope around her upper body, securing her tightly to the cold steel, the pressure constricting her breathing and sending waves of pain through her. She winced as the cords dug into her arms, pressing hard over the tape binding her wrists, the pain intensifying with each movement. Another strip of tape was plastered cruelly across her mouth, silencing any further attempts to speak, effectively cutting off her only means of communication. Bruno stepped back to admire their handiwork, his eyes gleaming with a sick satisfaction. Comfortable? He sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Grace's chest heaved with panicked breaths, her body trembling uncontrollably. She could barely move a muscle, her limbs numb and unresponsive. One of Bruno's men approached, his face etched with concern. Boss, what's the plan? Are we really calling Caruso here? That's risky. He could bring an army. Bruno gave him a hard stare, his eyes conveying a silent warning. Of course, he'll have backup. That's why we have leverage. He jerked his gun toward Grace, his eyes glinting with a malevolent light. We'll set terms he can't refuse. Once he's here, we use her to keep him in line. Then, well, accidents happen. Grace's blood ran cold, the implications of his words sending a shiver down her spine. Bruno fully intended to kill Vincent. She had no doubt about it. And likely her, too. Once she'd outlived her usefulness, she would be nothing more than an expendable pawn in his twisted game. Bruno pulled out a phone and dialed, his fingers moving with a practiced ease. Grace's heart hammered in her chest, each beat echoing her mounting terror. He was calling Vincent. She strained to remain calm, forcing herself to focus every ounce of her energy, to find some way to warn Vincent of the danger that awaited him. Perhaps this was Vincent's chance to locate them, to pinpoint their location and launch a rescue mission. The phone was likely untraceable, but if only she could make a noise, give him some kind of clue, anything that might alert him to the trap that was about to be sprung. But the tape over her mouth stifled any scream, any cry for help. Her eyes darted around frantically, searching for something, anything, that might offer a glimmer of hope. On the ground near her feet lay a rusty screw that had fallen from the old beam, its jagged edges catching the dim light. In a desperate flash of inspiration, Grace began scraping the edge of her shoe against it, hoping to drag it loudly across the concrete floor, creating a sound that might somehow penetrate the layers of deception and reach Vincent's ears. The shrill scrape of metal on concrete echoed faintly in the vast warehouse, its sound amplified by the silence and tension that permeated the air. Bruno shot her a glare, his eyes filled with suspicion, and she went still, her heart pounding in her chest like a trapped bird. Hopefully, the noise was enough for someone on the other end to catch, to register as something out of the ordinary. It was the only thing she could think to try, her only act of defiance in this desperate situation. Bruno spoke into the phone, his voice dripping with mock cordiality, his words a carefully constructed facade designed to deceive and manipulate. Vincent, good to talk to you, boss. Even from a few feet away, Grace could hear the faint, tiny sound of Vincent's voice responding sharply. Though she couldn't make out any words, her hearing muffled by the tape. Relief flooded through her. A fleeting moment of hope in the face of overwhelming despair. He was on the line. He was alive. Now, Bruno continued, circling near Grace as he talked, his eyes never leaving her. No need for threats. I've got something of yours and you've got something I want. Let's keep this civil for the moment, eh? Grace closed her eyes briefly, concentrating on Vincent's tone, trying to decipher any hidden messages, any clues that might help him understand the danger he was facing. He sounded furious, urgent, his voice tight with suppressed anger. She hoped he was okay, that he hadn't been injured in the trap Bruno had mentioned. Bruno walked closer and, in a sudden, brutal move, ripped the tape off Grace's mouth again, tearing a startled cry from her. He held the phone toward her face, his eyes gleaming with a sadistic pleasure. Say hello to your gallant knight, sweetheart. Grace's throat tightened, fear and emotion constricting her voice. Vincent, she managed, her voice cracking with fear and emotion, barely audible above the pounding of her heart. Grace. Vincent's voice came clearly through the speaker now, his words a beacon of hope in the darkness. He sounded alarmed but steady, his voice a soothing balm to her tormented soul. I'm here. I'm gonna get you out of this. Do you hear me? Before she could reply, before she could express the torrent of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her, Bruno yanked the phone back, his face contorted with anger. Enough. He sneered at the device, his eyes filled with contempt. You want her back alive, Vincent? Here are my terms. You're going to meet me alone. No men, no weapons. Bring 5 million in cash, unmarked small bills. He grinned, obviously enjoying himself, reveling in the power he wielded. We'll do an exchange. The girl for you and the money. Then maybe I let you both live. Maybe I don't. But if I see any of your goons or suspect a trap, she's dead before you can even blink. Grace felt tears slip down her cheeks, the despair and terror threatening to overwhelm her, to consume her entirely. Vincent's voice came hard as steel through the phone, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. Bruno, if you harm her... His voice hardened, a barely contained threat. You're in no position to dictate. Bruno snapped, his eyes flashing with rage. I'll text you the location. 15 minutes. And Vincent, I wasn't joking about coming alone. I'll know if you bring friends. With that, he ended the call, severing the lifeline that had briefly connected them. The warehouse fell silent, the only sound Grace's ragged breathing, each breath a testament to her fear and desperation. Bruno's men shifted uneasily, their faces betraying their growing anxiety. They clearly understood how volatile the situation was, how precarious their position. Bruno exhaled as if bracing himself, steeling his nerves for the confrontation to come. He checked the cylinder of his revolver, his movements swift and practiced, then nodded to his crew. Take positions. When Caruso comes, keep out of sight but guns trained. If things go south, we finish it. He glanced at Grace, bound to the pillar, his eyes devoid of any remorse. And if he tries anything funny, shoot her first. Grace's blood turned to ice, the weight of his words crushing her. One of the thugs, a gaunt man with a snake tattoo snaking up his neck, smirked at her as he took cover behind a crate, aiming a pistol in her direction, his eyes glinting with a predatory hunger. She squeezed her eyes shut, silently praying, sending a desperate plea into the darkness. Vincent, please be careful. Please don't do anything foolish. The next 15 minutes felt like the longest of her life, an eternity of fear and uncertainty. Every drip of water from the leaky roof and creak of metal echoed in the vast space, amplifying the tension and driving her closer to the edge of despair. Grace's wrists burned under the tape from her futile attempts to wriggle free, each movement only serving to intensify the pain and chafing. She had no way to warn Vincent of the ambush lying in wait, no way to alert him to the danger that awaited him. At last, distant footsteps approached outside, their sound echoing in the silence. The small side door to the warehouse creaked open, its hinges protesting the movement. Vincent Caruso stepped in alone, just as demanded, his figure silhouetted against the dim light. Grace almost sobbed in a mixture of relief and fear at the sight of him, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. He was clad in a dark overcoat against the night chill, his expression composed, but his eyes blazing as they immediately locked onto her. His gaze filled with a raw intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. He took in her condition, tied up, bruised cheek, tear-streaked face, and a murderous fury flickered across his features, his jaw clenching as he fought to control his rage. He was angry, but calm. He quickly masked it, but the raw emotion was still present. "All right, I'm here," Vincent called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. His words a challenge to Bruno and his men. He held up a large black duffel bag, the symbol of his surrender, and then let it drop at his feet with a heavy thud, the sound reverberating through the warehouse. "There's your money, Bruno. Let her go." Bruno emerged from behind a stack of pallets, his figure menacing in the dim light, gun leveled casually at Vincent. His eyes filled with a predatory hunger. "Kick the bag over here," he ordered, his voice devoid of any emotion. Vincent nudged the duffel forward with his foot, his movements deliberate and controlled. It slid a few yards across the concrete floor, stopping a few feet from Bruno. Bruno gestured to one of his men, who rushed forward and snatched the bag, retreating to a safe distance to peek inside, confirming that the ransom had indeed been paid. Bundles of cash were clearly visible, stacked neatly inside the bag. Bruno seemed momentarily surprised that Vincent had actually brought the ransom, that he had been willing to sacrifice so much to save her. "Very good," he said, his voice laced with a sardonic undertone. "5 million, as asked." "You'll find it's all there," Vincent replied evenly, his hands slightly raised to show he wasn't armed, his posture relaxed but alert, like a coiled spring ready to unleash. His eyes flicked to Grace again, silently asking if she was okay, his gaze conveying a silent reassurance. She managed a tiny nod, tears threatening to spill once more, her emotions a tangled mess of fear, relief, and gratitude. Bruno chuckled, stepping closer to Vincent, his eyes glinting with a cruel amusement. "What an obedient boss you turned out to be. All that money and you just handed it over. Must be a special girl, this one." He sneered back at Grace, his eyes filled with contempt. Vincent's jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his control beginning to fray. "You have what you want, Bruno. Now let her go as you promised." Bruno circled slowly, like a predator toying with its prey, and only then did Vincent show a hint of nerves, his eyes darting around the warehouse, likely aware that Bruno's henchmen were hiding nearby with guns trained on them, waiting for his moment to strike. "Oh, I promised I'd consider it," Bruno said, dragging out the last word, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But, now that I think about it, tying up loose ends is safer." Grace's heart seized, a cold wave of fear washing over her. She saw Bruno's finger twitch on the trigger, his eyes gleaming with a murderous intent. In that split second, several things happened at once, time seeming to slow to a crawl. Bruno whipped his arm toward Vincent, pulling the trigger, his action swift and decisive. At the same time, Grace mustered every ounce of courage and threw her weight sideways against the pillar with a shrill, muffled cry, just enough to draw Bruno's attention for a split instant, to divert his focus from Vincent. The gunshot cracked like thunder in the enclosed space, its sound deafening. Vincent lunged aside with reflexes honed by a lifetime of living on the edge, his movements fluid and instinctive. The bullet meant for his chest grazed his upper arm instead, tearing through his coat and leaving a searing trail of pain. He staggered, but somehow managed to keep his footing, his determination unwavering. Instantly, the warehouse erupted in chaos, a symphony of gunfire and shouting that shattered the silence. A rifle report sounded from high above, one of Vincent's hidden snipers, secretly positioned on a catwalk, taking his shot. Bruno's man with the snake tattoo went down before he could even fire at Grace, a precise shot to his shoulder disarming him, his gun clattering harmlessly to the floor. Another of Bruno's men opened up with an automatic burst from behind some crates, his bullets spraying wildly. Vincent dove behind a steel drum as bullets sparked off the concrete, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the acrid taste of fear. Grace could only watch in terror as a full-blown firefight exploded around her, her position hopelessly exposed against the pillar. Bruno, cursing violently, retreated toward her, seizing her shoulder and pressing the barrel of his gun to her temple, his grip like a vice. "Everyone hold your fire!" Bruno screamed, his voice raw with desperation, his words echoing in the warehouse. "Or I swear I'll kill her." The shooting slowly tapered off, the sound of gunfire gradually fading into a tense silence. A tense silence fell again, punctuated only by the drip of Bruno's henchman's blood pooling from the sniper's hit and the distant whine of a ricocheting bullet, a testament to the violence that had just erupted. Grace's pulse thundered in her ears, her breathing shallow and rapid. Bruno was using her as a human shield now, his arm in a vice-like grip around her neck, his body pressed tightly against her back, her every move controlled by him. She met Vincent's gaze across the dim space, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. He had taken cover not far away, and she saw with horror that blood was seeping through his sleeve from the grazing wound, staining the fabric a dark crimson. But his focus was entirely on the barrel pressed to Grace's head, his every thought consumed by her safety. "Let's all just calm down," Vincent said, his voice remarkably steady despite the gun pointed directly at the woman he cared about most, the woman he had vowed to protect. His raised hands were faintly stained red, presumably from checking his wound, and his face was pale but determined, his eyes unwavering. "Bruno, you don't want to do this. You shoot her, you lose your only bargaining chip. There's no way out then." Bruno panted behind Grace, his chest heaving against her back, his body trembling uncontrollably. "Shut up. I'll do it. I'll kill her right now." The muzzle dug painfully against Grace's temple, making her whimper, her body rigid with fear. Vincent's eyes never left hers, his gaze conveying a silent message of love and reassurance. "Bruno," he continued carefully, his voice calm and measured, "think about what your father would say." That made Bruno hesitate, his grip on her arm loosening just a fraction. Grace felt the pressure of the gun ease just a fraction as Bruno barked out a humorless laugh, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Don't you dare talk about my father, Caruso. He respected loyalty." Vincent spoke softly, his words a gentle plea designed to break through Bruno's anger and resentment. "He wouldn't have wanted this." Bruno growled, his arm visibly trembling, his resolve wavering. Grace sensed his desperation mounting, his control slipping. She knew Vincent was trying to stall and de-escalate the situation, to buy time and prevent further bloodshed. But Bruno seemed to be beyond reason, lost in his own twisted world of anger and revenge. Her own fear had crystallized into a kind of clarity, her thoughts sharp and focused. If she did nothing, Bruno might very well shoot her out of spite, driven by his own self-destruction, and even if he didn't, one of Vincent's men might take a risky shot, and she'd end up caught in the crossfire, an innocent victim of their deadly game. She had to create an opening, any opening at all, to give Vincent a chance to save her. Trusting Vincent and relying on raw instinct, the primal urge to survive, Grace suddenly drove the back of her heel down onto Bruno's foot as hard as she could, her body trembling with effort. At the same time, she flung her head backward with all her might, her actions swift and decisive. Her head connected squarely with Bruno's chin, the impact jarring her to the core. He yelled in pain and surprise, his grip loosening just enough, his body recoiling from the force of the blow. In that fleeting moment, a window of opportunity opened, a brief respite from the horror. Grace tore free of his arm and dropped to the floor in a desperate duck, her movements instinctive and desperate. A single gunshot rang out, its sound deafening in the silence. Grace hit the cold concrete floor hard, her shoulder exploding with pain, her body twisting awkwardly, but she was miraculously clear of Bruno, escaping his grasp by a hair's breadth. Bruno stood for an instant, his eyes wide with shock, his body frozen in place. A crimson rose blossomed on his chest, right where a sniper's bullet had found its mark, the blood spreading rapidly across his shirt. He staggered backward, the gun slipping from his nerveless fingers and clattering harmlessly to the ground, its metallic sound a stark reminder of the violence that had just transpired. With a strangled gasp, a sound of surprise and defeat, Bruno collapsed onto his back, his body falling heavily onto the concrete floor. It was over as fast as it had begun, a whirlwind of violence that had left her breathless and shaken. Grace lay on the cold floor, stunned and disoriented, her body numb with shock, until strong hands gently turned her over, their touch surprisingly gentle. Vincent was there, dropping to his knees beside her, his eyes filled with concern, ignoring his own injury entirely, his focus solely on her well-being. "Grace," he breathed, his voice filled with relief and tenderness, and within moments he had a knife out, its blade glinting in the light, slicing through the ropes that bound her to the pillar and the tape around her wrists, freeing her from her captivity. His hands shook just a little as he peeled the tape from her mouth for the last time, his touch gentle and soothing. "Vincent!" Grace sobbed in relief, her voice cracking with emotion, and flung her freed arms around him, clinging to him as if he might vanish into thin air, her body trembling with relief. "I knew you'd come," she managed to choke out between sobs, her words a testament to her faith in him. The sheer, overwhelming relief of being alive and safe in his arms washed over her in a powerful wave, threatening to drown her in its intensity. Vincent held her fiercely against him, his arms wrapped tightly around her, his body a shield against the horrors she had just endured. "I'm so sorry," he murmured into her hair, his voice rough with emotion, his words filled with remorse. "I'm so sorry I let this happen to you." Grace pulled back just enough to meet his gaze, her eyes filled with tears, her heart overflowing with emotion. "It's not your fault," she whispered, reaching up to gently touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines of worry etched there. Only then did she notice that he was bleeding, that his sleeve was stained with crimson. "You're hit. You're hurt." "It's nothing," he assured her, dismissing her concern with a wave of his hand. Up close, the graze on his upper arm looked nasty, the wound raw and angry, but not deep, just a scratch. His eyes roamed over her frantically, checking for injuries, his gaze searching her face for any sign of pain. "Are you hurt?" "No," Grace said, though her cheeks smarted from the slap and her body was sore all over from being manhandled and tied up, the trauma of the experience leaving its mark. "I'm okay." Vincent exhaled a breath of profound relief, the tension draining from his body. He cradled her face between his hands, his touch gentle and loving. "I was so afraid," he admitted, his carefully constructed composure cracking just a little, revealing the depth of his emotions. "When I realized Bruno had you, I thought I might lose you, Grace." Grace's heart swelled with emotion, her love for him overflowing. She saw raw fear and affection in his eyes, a vulnerability that she had never witnessed before, and realized in that moment just how much he truly cared for her, how deeply her well-being affected him. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "You kept your promise." He managed a small, shaky smile, his lips curving upwards in a gesture of relief. Behind them, Angelo and a few of Vincent's men were moving through the warehouse, disarming the remaining conscious henchmen and checking on the wounded, their movements efficient and professional. The immediate danger had passed, and Vincent's crew had clearly gained control of the situation, restoring order to the chaos. But Grace and Vincent were cocooned in their own world, oblivious to everything around them, lost in the relief of finding each other again. Carefully, Vincent helped her to her feet, his arms supporting her. She swayed. "Have you ever found yourself caught in a whirlwind? A maelstrom of chaos where shadows dance and danger lurks at every turn? Then imagine being swept into that storm not by choice, but by fate itself." Unsteadily, she faltered, and he, a fortress of strength, steadied her, his arm a protective embrace. As they moved toward the exit, Grace risked a glance back at Bruno, now a fallen figure, his betrayal met with its chilling consequence. She shuddered, burying her face against Vincent's shoulder, seeking refuge from the haunting image. "Don't look," he murmured, his voice a soothing balm, gently guiding her into the cool pre-dawn air. Flashing lights painted the alley in hues of blue and red, an emergency symphony announcing the aftermath. Someone, a watchful neighbor or perhaps one of Vincent's loyal sentinels, had alerted the authorities. Yet Vincent's influence, a silent, powerful force, was already at play. Officers nodded with deference, allowing him to escort Grace to a waiting car, whisking them away from the chaos they left behind. Bruno's desperate gamble fading into the distance. Only when they were safely removed from the scene did Vincent finally allow himself to sag back against the seat, pulling Grace into a tight embrace. She nestled against him, seeking solace in the steady, reassuring rhythm of his heart beating beneath her cheek. "It's over," he whispered, the words a fragile shield against the lingering darkness, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as her. His lips brushed against the top of her head, a silent promise of protection. Grace tilted her face upward, tears glistening in her eyes like scattered stardust. "Thank you, Vincent," she said softly, her voice filled with a gratitude that transcended words. "For coming for me, for everything." He cupped her cheek with infinite tenderness, his thumb tracing delicate circles on her skin. "There's nothing I wouldn't do for you, Grace. Don't you know that by now?" The intensity of his words resonated within her, sending a wave of warmth through her very being. Despite everything, the kidnapping, the palpable fear, the brush with death, a surge of happiness and undeniable love washed over her. Perhaps it was the adrenaline, the shared trauma of their near loss, but Grace found herself drawn to him, rising to meet his lips in a gentle, trembling kiss. Vincent inhaled sharply, answering her with equal tenderness, his hand sliding to the nape of her neck, holding her as if she were a precious dream he feared would vanish. The world around them seemed to dissolve, the shadows of crime lords and lurking dangers fading into insignificance. There was only the two of them, confirming in that sweet, desperate kiss what words had yet to fully articulate. When they finally parted, Vincent rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the stillness. He was smiling, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his gray eyes into pools of molten silver in the sunlight. Grace smiled back, a soft laugh of pure relief escaping her lips. "You're incredible," he whispered, his thumb gently brushing away a tear from her cheek. "You know that? You saved my life back there, too," distracting him. "You're as brave as they come, Grace Delaney." Her cheeks flushed with warmth, and she shook her head modestly. "I was so scared. Yet you still fought," he said, pride coloring his voice. "My little heroine." The endearment sent a delightful shiver down her spine. She curled into his side, allowing exhaustion to claim her as the adrenaline slowly receded. Vincent held her close throughout the entire journey back, his grip never faltering, a silent vow of protection and unwavering affection. 6 months later, a gentle summer sunset painted the city skyline in hues of gold and pink. From the balcony of Vincent's penthouse, Grace watched the lights of Manhattan begin to twinkle, one by one, as dusk settled over the sprawling metropolis. In the reflection of the glass railing, she saw Vincent approach from behind, carrying 2 glasses of champagne, offering one to her with a soft, knowing smile. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that resonated deep within her soul. Grace accepted the flute and clinked it lightly against his. "To us," she added warmly, her eyes reflecting the shimmering city lights. They sipped their champagne in comfortable silence, gazing out at the breathtaking view. So much had transpired in the past 6 months, a transformation so profound it still amazed Grace. After Bruno's demise and the subsequent unraveling of his treachery, Vincent had solidified his position, purging the remaining corruption from his organization. True to his word, he had guided many of his operations toward legitimate ventures, with Grace acting as his invaluable compass. She had officially become Vincent Caruso's financial consultant, But everyone within his inner circle understood that she was far more than just an employee. She was his trusted partner, his confidant, the anchor to his soul. The initial suspicious murmurs that had greeted her arrival, the skepticism surrounding an outsider infiltrating their inner sanctum, had long since faded after she consistently proved her business savvy, optimizing ventures and generating profits. Even the most traditional of Vincent's capos had come to respect the young woman who had saved their boss's life and enriched the family's coffers through entirely legal means. Grace had also, with Vincent's loving encouragement and unwavering support, completed her degree. Her graduation ceremony had taken place just a week prior, a milestone that filled her with an immense sense of accomplishment. She remembered Vincent attending in person, his presence a silent declaration of pride, watching as she walked across the stage. Afterward, he had enveloped her in a tight embrace, whispering, "I'm so proud of you." In her ear, his words a precious gem she held close to her heart. She sighed contentedly, leaning on the balcony rail. Far below, the city traffic littered and flowed like a river of light, a constant reminder of the vibrant life surrounding them. It struck her how much her perspective had shifted, both literally and figuratively. Once, she had felt lost and insignificant, merely serving cocktails to the wealthy and powerful. Now, she stood confidently beside one of the most powerful men in the city, her own skills and voice valued and respected, an integral part of his world. She mused with a small, contented smile, her heart overflowing with gratitude and affection. Vincent set down his champagne glass and slid an arm around her waist, drawing her closer. "A penny for your thoughts," he murmured, nuzzling gently against her temple. Grace turned to face him, slipping her free hand inside his suit jacket to rest against his chest, feeling the warmth of his body and the reassuring rhythm of his heartbeat. "I was just thinking how I never imagined any of this," she said, her gaze shining with happiness, reflecting the city lights and the love that filled her heart. "If you hadn't asked me that ridiculous question about business that night at Giovanni's." Vincent chuckled, a deep, pleasant sound that still made her stomach flutter with anticipation. "Ah yes, my poor attempt at humor that turned out to be the best investment strategy I've ever had." Grace laughed, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "An investment in a waitress." "An investment in you," he corrected, gently brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch sending a delicious shiver down her spine. "And it's paid off beyond my wildest dreams." She felt her eyes prick with happy tears, emotions threatening to spill over. "For me, too," she whispered, her voice filled with sincerity. Vincent's face grew serious, his features etched with purpose in the golden light of the setting sun. He carefully took her champagne flute and set both glasses aside. Then, he took her hands in his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her veins. "Grace, there's something I want to ask you." Her heart skipped a beat, her senses heightened. His tone, the tender intensity in his gaze, made her catch her breath, a wave of anticipation washing over her. "I know a life with me wasn't exactly what you planned," Vincent said softly, his thumbs stroking the back of her hands, his touch both comforting and electrifying. "It's not the easiest path, but you've been my light through some dark times and my partner in building something better. I can't imagine my world without you in it." He reached into his pocket and slowly sank down on one knee, his movements deliberate and filled with reverence. Grace's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with astonished joy, tears welling up and threatening to spill over. Vincent revealed a small velvet box, opening it to display a ring. A solitary diamond on a simple, elegant band that sparkled with an inner fire, reflecting the love that burned within him. His own eyes shone up at her as he spoke, his voice a touch unsteady for perhaps the first time since she'd known him, the vulnerability in his tone only amplifying the depth of his love. "Grace Delaney, will you marry me?" Tears spilled freely down her cheeks now, a torrent of joy and overwhelming emotion, but her smile was radiant, a beacon of happiness illuminating her face. "Yes," she answered, hardly waiting for him to finish speaking, her voice filled with conviction and unwavering love. "Yes, Vincent, of course I will." A rare look of relief and pure happiness broke across his face, erasing the shadows that had haunted him for so long. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, a symbol of their destined union. Then, he rose and Grace threw her arms around him, sealing her answer with a heartfelt kiss, a promise of forever etched in their souls. They stayed entwined, foreheads touching, as the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of purple and gold. Grace couldn't stop admiring the ring, not for its material worth, but for what it symbolized. How far they'd come from that fateful evening, the improbable journey that had brought them to this moment of shared hope and profound commitment. "Mrs. Caruso," Vincent murmured, testing the sound of it and chuckling softly when Grace's blush returned, a wave of affection washing over him. He cradled her cheek, his eyes filled with love, reflecting her own happiness back at her. "You've made me the happiest man alive, and you've made me the happiest woman," she replied sincerely, her voice filled with unwavering love. She placed her hand over his heart, feeling its strong, steady beat, the heart of a man who had been feared by many, but whom she knew in all his facets. The formidable leader, the fiercely protective lover, the thoughtful partner. Their journey had been anything but ordinary, a complex mix of danger, laughter, and undeniable passion. A tapestry woven with threads of darkness and light. But it had led them right here, to this moment of shared hope and profound commitment, a testament to the power of love to conquer all. As they gazed out at the shimmering lights of their city, Vincent wrapped his arms around his future bride from behind, drawing her closer. Grace leaned back against him with a contented sigh, surrendering to the warmth of his embrace. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked softly, his voice a whisper against her hair. It was a question he had posed in different ways before, driven by lingering guilt for the dangers she had faced by being with him, the sacrifices she had made for their love. Grace shook her head and smiled, her eyes shining with unwavering conviction. "Not one bit. The path that brought us together might have been unexpected, even crazy at times, but I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. It led me to you." Vincent pressed a gentle kiss to her hair, his touch filled with tenderness and gratitude. "And you to me." In the distance, the Chrysler Building spire lit up, casting a warm glow over the sprawling skyline, a beacon of hope in the vast expanse. The city hummed with life below them, a symphony of sounds and sensations. But here, in their elevated sanctuary, it felt like their own little world, a haven of peace and love. Grace interlaced her fingers with Vincent's, the diamond of her engagement ring catching the light and sending out tiny bursts of shimmering brilliance, reflecting the boundless love that shone between them. She thought of the shy, uncertain waitress she had been, struggling and filled with self-doubt, and the confident, accomplished woman she had become, loved, cherished, and deeply in love. Who would have believed that a mafia boss's offhand, joking question would lead to this kind of fairy tale? "Life sure is full of surprises," she mused aloud, echoing words Vincent had once said to her, the memory bringing a smile to her lips. He chuckled, recognizing the callback, and gave her hand a light squeeze, a silent acknowledgement of the extraordinary journey they had shared. The best ones, anyway. Together, they stood watching the night unfurl over New York, ready to face the future side by side, their hearts intertwined. Whatever challenges might come their way, they had each other. An unlikely pair bound by unwavering trust, extraordinary courage, and a love born from the most unexpected of beginnings, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. And for Vincent and Grace, that was the greatest investment of all, one that would undoubtedly last a lifetime, a legacy of love that would echo through the ages.